They thought they were ready for human culture, but the galactic community had never encountered a species that entertained itself by practicing how to experience absolute terror. The Grand Pavilion of Oakhaven was a masterpiece of harmonious architecture, woven entirely from living luminescent pearlwood and towering arches of singing crystal. It was the architectural crown jewel of the Galactic Federation's capital world, a venue reserved only for the most profound historic events. Tonight, it was hosting the newly inducted species from a blue marble in the Orion Arm. Humanity had arrived, and Arthur Vance, Earth's newly appointed cultural liaison, was sweating right through his tailored formal suit. Arthur stood at the control podium, looking out over an audience of thousands. In attendance were the highest-ranking diplomats, senators, and cultural attachés from across the Federation. He saw the towering four-armed Thracians in their ceremonial armor, the amphibious Maruvians resting in their hydration spheres and sitting in the premier front-row seating, the Zenthari. The Zenthari were the spiritual and emotional anchor of the Federation. They were tall, elegant beings with translucent skin that shimmered with the soft colors of their internal moods. They were completely telepathic and deeply empathetic, capable of feeling the emotional state of a room with exquisite precision. Arthur had been warned that their sensibilities were delicate, but he was confident in his selection for the evening. To prove humanity's profound emotional depth and artistic sophistication, Arthur had bypassed the chaotic action movies and the confusingly subjective comedies. Instead, he chose a cinematic masterpiece, a classic, slow-burn, atmospheric thriller of the horror genre. There was no excessive gore, no cheap violence. It was a masterclass in tension, suspense, and the creeping dread of the unknown. It was meant to show the galaxy that humans could weave complex emotions out of light and shadow. He leaned into the microphone. He explained to the assembled dignitaries that human art often simulated intense situations to explore the boundaries of the psyche. He spoke of catharsis, of the safe environment of the theater, and of the shared experience of surviving a story. The translation matrices delivered his words seamlessly to the varied auditory receptors of the audience. With a confident nod to the technician, Arthur dimmed the ambient bioluminescence of the pavilion. The massive curved holoscreen at the front of the hall flared to life, projecting the stark, hauntingly beautiful black and white opening shots of an isolated Gothic manor. The low, mournful groan of a cello echoed through the state-of-the-art acoustic field. Almost immediately, Arthur noticed a shift in the room. The Federation species had evolved in a profoundly different way than humanity. To be accepted into the Federation, a species had to prove it had moved past its predatory instincts centuries ago. But the truth went deeper than that. Most of the apex species in the Federation had never been predators at all. They evolved on gentle, cooperative garden worlds where the most aggressive wildlife was equivalent to a territorial bumblebee. They had no biological concept of malice, no evolutionary instinct to hide from the dark, and absolutely no psychological framework for a predator that hunted for sport. What Arthur did not realize was exactly how deeply a species lacking a predator-prey dynamic would misinterpret a simulated threat. To them, there was no firewall between fiction and reality. On the screen, the human protagonist, a young woman with wide, expressive eyes, walked slowly down a shadowed hallway. The floorboards protested under her weight. The camera angle was tight, suffocating, deliberately restricting the viewer's line of sight. In the front row, the Zenthari delegates were shifting. Their normally serene, pearlescent skin was flashing rapidly with jagged streaks of bruised violet and harsh crimson. Arthur tapped his earpiece, checking the translation feed. He tuned into the low-level murmurs of the audience. They were not murmurs of appreciation. They were expressions of profound existential confusion. Why was the human female entering a low-visibility corridor alone? Why was the atmospheric pressure in the audio track designed to induce cardiac arrhythmia? Why was there an unseen presence radiating hostile intent? Then, the true disaster began. Because the Xanthari were an empathic species, they did not just watch the movie, they felt it. And as the tension on the screen ratcheted upward, the Xanthari began to absorb the simulated, synthesized terror of the human actress. Their minds, completely uncalloused by generations of nightmares, could not process the artificial fear. To a Xanthari, if you feel terror, the terror is real. The protagonist on the screen reached a heavy oak door. Her hand trembled as it hovered over the brass doorknob. The music dropped away to total, suffocating silence. Arthur watched in mounting panic as the Xanthari delegation rose from their seats. They were no longer just glowing red, they were vibrating. A low, harmonic hum began to resonate from their bodies. They were unintentionally broadcasting the sheer, unfiltered terror they were experiencing directly into the minds of every other alien in the pavilion. The Thracians clutched their armored chest plates, gasping for air as phantom panic attacks gripped their multiple hearts. The Maruvians thrashed wildly inside their hydration spheres, the water churning into a froth. Arthur scrambled for the control panel, his fingers desperately searching for the emergency abort switch. He slammed his hand down on the console. But the system, recognizing a massive localized psychic anomaly, had already engaged its protective firewalls, locking him out of the manual override. On the screen, the young woman turned the doorknob. The door swung open. A grotesque, distorted shadow leaped from the darkness, accompanied by a deafening, shrieking orchestral sting. In the grand pavilion, the Xanthari minds collectively shattered. It was a phenomenon known in Federation medical texts as a psychic cascade, an event so rare it hadn't been recorded in 3 millennia. The sudden, violent discharge of raw, unadulterated fear from the most powerful telepaths in the galaxy slammed into the physical environment of Oakhaven. Reality itself buckled under the weight of their terror. The air temperature plummeted instantly, plunging the amphitheater into sub-zero conditions. Frost crystallized violently across the singing crystal arches, shattering them with explosive force. Shards of glass rained down on the panicked diplomats. Then the gravity failed. The localized psychic shockwave disrupted the gravitational plating beneath the floor. Entire rows of heavy, ornate seating ripped free from their moorings, floating lazily into the air along with the thrashing, terrified delegates strapped into them. Arthur grabbed the edge of his podium to keep from being pulled upward into the chaotic zero-gravity vortex forming in the center of the room. He watched helplessly as the apex of galactic society devolved into a swirling, screaming mass of primal panic. A Thracian diplomat drifted past him, swinging his forearms wildly, his eyes wide with a terror his species hadn't felt since their primordial swamps. The automated defense systems of the Grand Pavilion finally registered the catastrophic environmental collapse. A blaring rhythmic klaxon filled the air, replacing the audio of the movie. Heavy blast doors slammed down over the exits, sealing the room. Amber emergency strobes cut through the sudden darkness, casting long, nightmarish shadows across the floating debris and panicked dignitaries. From the ceiling, heavy anti-riot suppression foam rained down, intended to smother fires but instead coating the floating aliens in thick, suffocating white sludge. The doors at the rear of the pavilion were breached with a deafening detonation. Heavily armored security forces from the Kalan Republic stormed the room. The Kalan were a stoic, hyper-logical species, unaffected by the psychic bleed due to their dense, structured neural pathways. They moved with terrifying efficiency, deploying grav nets to pull the floating dignitaries back to the floor and injecting the hyperventilating Xanthari with heavy sedatives. 2 massive Kalan guards locked their sights on Arthur. They crossed the room in enormous bounds, their magnetic boots locking onto the floor plates. Before Arthur could utter a word of defense, he was driven hard into the pearl wood floor, his arms pinned painfully behind his back. He managed to turn his head just in time to see a Kalen heavy weapons specialist raise a plasma rifle and fire a concentrated blast directly into the hollow screen, incinerating the image of the screaming human woman. The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the sweeping amber strobes and the sparks of the shattered crystal. Through the ringing in his ears, Arthur heard the booming, amplified voice of the Federation High Consul, who was currently pinned beneath a fallen piece of crystal architecture. The consul was shouting orders to the security chief, declaring that humanity had deliberately deployed a devastating biological weapon disguised as cultural data. The calls for Earth's immediate expulsion from the Federation and possible military retaliation were already beginning. Arthur's heart pounded against his ribs. In less than 20 minutes, he had managed to turn a diplomatic handshake into an act of interstellar terrorism. Humanity was going to be exiled to the dark edges of the galaxy, all because of a movie. But as the Kalen guards hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the exit, Arthur noticed something that made his blood run cold for an entirely different reason. Standing amidst the wreckage, untouched by the panic and ignoring the screaming diplomats around her, was a single Kalen investigator. She was staring at the melted, smoking remnants of the hollow screen. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear. Her posture was rigid, utterly captivated by the phantom echoes of the simulated nightmare that still hung in the frozen air. If the Kalen were purely logical, why did she look like she wanted to see the end of the film? The interrogation room was designed to break spirits with geometry alone, a perfect sphere of blinding white light where shadows were scientifically impossible. It was here that Earth's cultural legacy was officially classified as a weapon of mass destruction. Arthur Vance sat perfectly still in the center of the sphere, strapped into a high-density restraint chair that monitored his heart rate, perspiration, and neural activity. Surrounding him were the towering, hard-light holographic projections of the Federation High Council. They loomed like angry gods in the sterile space. The Thracian delegates were practically vibrating with outrage, their forearms crossed tightly over their armored chests, while the Maruvian representatives floated in their hydration spheres with their respiratory gills flared in disgust. Notably absent were the Zenthari, who were currently sequestered in deep-dive medical comas to purge the phantom trauma of a fictional haunted house from their collective consciousness. Stepping through a seamless opening in the white wall was the Kalen investigator Arthur had noticed in the ruined theater. She moved with a liquid, predatory grace that commanded immediate attention. Her name was Xylar. She wore the stark, angular uniform of the Federation Security Directorate, her posture rigidly perfect, her skin a striking pale alabaster that contrasted sharply with her piercing, obsidian eyes. The Kalen were renowned across the galaxy for their hyper-logical minds and their absolute immunity to emotional manipulation. They were the ultimate arbiters of truth, functioning essentially as living supercomputers. Xylar did not look at the glowing holograms of the Council. She walked in a slow, calculated orbit around Arthur's chair, holding a translucent data slate. The High Consul, a massive avian being with glittering plumage, slammed a feathered fist onto his podium, sending a digital shockwave through his hologram. He declared that humanity had engineered a psychological virus. He accused Earth of purposefully bypassing the Federation's kinetic and biological defense grids by smuggling a predatory pathogen straight into the minds of the galaxy's most vulnerable leaders. Several rival factions immediately chimed in, demanding crippling trade embargoes, an orbital blockade of Earth, and the immediate revocation of humanity's Federation status. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to ignore the restrictive bands tightening across his chest. He spoke clearly, addressing the towering holograms. He stated that it was just a movie. He explained that humanity did not create a weapon, but merely presented an interactive piece of art designed to evoke a specific emotional response. Xylar stopped her pacing and turned to face him, her obsidian eyes locking onto his. She spoke for the first time, her voice cool, melodic, and entirely devoid of inflection. She stated that analyzing the telemetry from the Grand Pavilion revealed a localized spike in cortisol, adrenaline, and extreme neural distress. She noted that humanity deliberately synchronized auditory dissonance with sudden visual kinetic strikes to artificially trigger the biological fight-or-flight response in the viewer. Arthur offered a weary smile, attempting to inject a shred of levity into the dire situation. He admitted that they call those jump scares. And back on Earth, people actually pay good currency to sit in the dark and subject themselves to them while eating popcorn. The Thracian delegate erupted, shouting that only a deeply diseased species would commodify their own biological panic. Arthur felt his temper flare, pushing back against the restraints. He addressed the council with a newfound intensity. He told them they needed to understand where humanity came from. Earth was not a manicured garden world bathed in perpetual harmony. Earth was a death world. He explained that human ancestors evolved on a chaotic rock where the flora possessed neurotoxins. The fauna actively hunted them, and the weather systems routinely attempted to scour them from the planet's surface. He leaned forward as far as the chair allowed. He explained that humans survived because they learned to anticipate danger. They practiced feeling fear. It was an evolutionary simulation, a mental vaccine. By exploring the darkest, most terrifying scenarios in the safety of a story, human minds built a callus against the horrors of the real universe. It taught them resilience. It taught them how to keep thinking when the lights went out and the monsters were real. Silence fell over the white sphere. It was a profound, uncomfortable silence. The alien delegates exchanged uneasy glances, struggling to comprehend a biological imperative born from such a hostile existence. To them, avoiding danger meant building better shields. To humans, avoiding danger meant looking it dead in the eye and figuring out how to kill it. The High Consul leaned forward, his avian features hardening into a mask of pure authoritarian resolve. He dismissed Arthur's defense entirely. He stated that the Federation was founded on the principles of ultimate safety, harmony, and the eradication of predatory impulses. He decreed that the very concept of simulated terror was fundamentally incompatible with a civilized galaxy. With a sweeping gesture of his wing, the High Consul officially enacted the Genesis Edict. The Federation Council ruled for a total, uncompromising ban on all human fear media. Every horror movie, thriller novel, suspense audio drama, and macabre piece of art produced by Earth was to be classified as a Class 1 cognitohazard. Possession, distribution, or consumption of this media would carry a mandatory sentence in a penal colony. Earth would remain in the Federation, but strictly on probation, facing severe economic sanctions to pay for the psychic damage inflicted upon Oakhaven. Arthur sank back into his chair, the weight of the disaster settling heavily on his shoulders. He had just inadvertently caused the largest censorship campaign in the history of the universe. The High Consul then turned his holographic gaze toward Xylar. He ordered that Arthur Vance be stripped of his diplomatic immunity. However, acknowledging Arthur's unique understanding of this hazardous material, the Council decided against immediate exile. Instead, Arthur was to be placed under the direct permanent custody and surveillance of investigator Xylar. He was now an asset of the Security Directorate, tasked with helping them identify and purge the remaining human cultural archives of all illicit content. The holograms winked out of existence, plunging the room back into sterile silence. Xylar tapped a command into her data slate, and the heavy restraint securing Arthur snapped open. He rubbed his wrists, standing up slowly under the intense scrutiny of his new warden. He expected a cold, logical dressing down, a robotic recitation of his new restricted parameters. Instead, Xylar stepped closer, violating the standard boundaries of personal space dictated by Kalen protocols. She looked up at him, her dark eyes flashing with something that looked dangerously close to curiosity. She lowered her voice so the room's ambient audio sensors could not pick it up. She asked him why the tempo of the stringed instruments dropped completely right before the visual anomaly breached the doorway. Arthur blinked, taken aback by the question. He realized she was asking about the cinematic mechanics of the jump scare. He explained that it was about building tension, making the audience lean in and hold their breath before releasing the pressure all at once. Xylar processed this information, her pale brow furrowing ever so slightly. She murmured that it was highly illogical, a deliberate manipulation of biological expectations. Yet, she admitted, her own neural pathways had registered a brief, inexplicable surge of dopamine immediately following the event. It was a paradox her logic centers were currently struggling to resolve. Before Arthur could unpack the revelation that the stoic Kalen investigator might actually be a closet adrenaline junkie, Xylar's data slate chimed with an urgent, high-priority alert. She stepped back, her demeanor instantly snapping back to professional rigidity. She brought the screen up, her eyes scanning the scrolling data rapidly. Arthur asked what was wrong, rubbing the tension from the back of his neck. Xylar looked from the screen to Arthur, her expression grim. She stated that the Council's quarantine protocols were too slow. The central data hub at the Grand Pavilion had been breached during the chaotic evacuation. The master file of The Haunting of Blackwood Manor had been illegally copied. She turned and marched toward the exit of the White Sphere, signaling for Arthur to follow. The containment had failed, and somewhere in the vast interconnected networks of the Galactic Federation, a brand new kind of contraband was already spreading. Prohibiting something across a galaxy of trillions does not eliminate the demand. It simply skyrockets the price. In less than a month, human nightmares had become the most valuable contraband in the Galactic Federation. The Genesis Edict backfired with spectacular speed. Alien species, thoroughly bored by millennia of utopian peace and gentle, conflict-free holodeck simulations, suddenly discovered they craved the forbidden thrill of adrenaline. Data crystals containing B-movie slashers, psychological thrillers, and vintage creature features were trading hands in the dark for the gross domestic product of small moons. Underground viewing clubs dubbed Scream Speakeasies sprouted like glowing fungus in the grimy neon-lit underbellies of orbital trade hubs. The Federation Security Directorate was rapidly overwhelmed by sudden, massive spikes in localized psychic distress across multiple star systems. It was the unmistakable, undeniable signature of an alien audience collectively losing its mind over a perfectly timed jump scare. Arthur Vance, once a celebrated cultural diplomat, was now functioning as a glorified intergalactic narcotics officer. He sat in the cramped, utilitarian passenger seat of Xylar's sleek interceptor, navigating the labyrinthine lower levels of the Corvus Prime space station. Xylar was proving to be a fascinating paradox. Her Kalen programming dictated that she follow the law perfectly, but her razor-sharp analytical mind was dangerously intrigued by the mechanics of the contraband they were hunting. Arthur provided the necessary cultural context, translating human cinematic tropes for her. While Xylar provided the tactical muscle and the legal authority, they were tracking a particularly severe psychic echo to a dimly lit cantina functioning as a front for a mid-level data runner. Arthur took the lead, using his natural human charisma to bypass the hulking, heavily armored reptilian bouncers at the door. He adopted the persona of a high-end buyer, claiming he was representing an anonymous client desperate for a pristine, uncompressed copy of a legendary 1980s slasher film involving a masked killer in a summer camp. Xylar stood back, cloaked in the shadows of the cantina, watching him work. Her obsidian eyes tracked his subtle shifts in body language. She analyzed his micro-expressions as a massive, multi-limbed smuggler tried to intimidate him, eventually drawing a glowing plasma blade and pressing it near Arthur's throat. Arthur did not flinch. He casually swatted the weapon aside with a steady hand, smoothly negotiating the price down while effectively disarming the criminal with pure, unadulterated swagger. 10 minutes later, they were back in the narrow, neon-drenched alleyway outside, the target's data slate safely confiscated. Xylar moved with sudden, startling speed. She pinned Arthur against the cold metal bulkhead of the station, her pale, angular face inches from his. It was not out of anger, but profound scientific curiosity. She pressed 2 cool fingers against his carotid artery, analyzing his steady pulse. She noted that his physiological control in a genuine life-or-death scenario was statistically anomalous for a non-combatant species. The proximity was electric. Arthur looked down into her dark, calculating eyes, feeling an undeniable pull. He smirked, adjusting his collar, and told her that compared to a cinematic demon possession, a plasma blade in a dark alley was just a minor inconvenience. A subtle, unfamiliar warmth flooded Xylar's pale cheeks, a biological reaction her Kalan logic centers could not immediately suppress or categorize. It was the quiet, undeniable spark of a reluctant romance, forged in the absurdity of their shared mission. Their confiscated data pointed them directly to Sector 4, a sprawling, derelict industrial warehouse district that served as the primary distribution hub for the entire sector's horror network. The plan was meticulously drafted by Xylar. Her heavy tactical squad of auxiliary Thracian and Maruvian enforcers would breach the main loading doors, while Arthur and Xylar secured the central server room in the back to prevent any data purges. They kicked in the heavy reinforced doors of the massive warehouse. The interior was a vast cavern packed with rows of illegally modified server racks, churning out thousands of copies of Earth's most terrifying cinema to be broadcast across the black market. The smugglers, a motley crew of various alien species, panicked and scrambled for cover. But these were not just street-level thugs. They were highly organized and equipped with stolen high-end theatrical technology from the Grand Pavilion. As Arthur and Xylar closed in on the main terminal, the smuggler captain, a desperate avian alien, slammed his fist onto a massive red override console. The ambient lighting in the warehouse instantly cut out, replaced by a sickly, flickering green strobe. The temperature plummeted to near freezing, breath misting in the sudden cold. A massive, high-fidelity holographic projection flickered to life in the dead center of the warehouse. It was an iconic human movie monster, a towering biomechanical nightmare with acidic saliva dripping from a secondary set of jaws. To Arthur, it was a classic, beloved piece of science fiction history. To the heavily armed, biologically peaceful alien security forces backing up Xylar, it was the literal embodiment of the apocalypse. The Kalan tactical squad might have remained stoic, but the auxiliary Thracian and Maruvian enforcers instantly succumbed to the manufactured psychic dread. The projection triggered a primal, instinctual panic response they possessed no mental defense against. Heavy plasma rifles clattered uselessly to the floor as the alien police force broke ranks entirely, screaming and fleeing the warehouse in absolute, unfiltered terror. Arthur and Xylar were suddenly left completely alone in the flickering green light, facing down a syndicate of heavily armed smugglers who were now emboldened by the retreating authorities. Worse yet, Xylar's wrist-mounted data slate began flashing a deep, urgent crimson. She rapidly analyzed the incoming data stream from the servers, her eyes widening in rare alarm. The smugglers were not just copying movies anymore. They were compiling the data into something entirely new, a concentrated digital weapon that was preparing to transmit far beyond the station's borders. The holographic nightmare towering over them was nothing but hard light and pixels. but the searing plasma bolts tearing through its translucent chest were definitively lethal. Arthur grabbed Xylar by the armored shoulder of her uniform, pulling her behind a reinforced server rack just as a volley of superheated energy turned the space where they had been standing into a molten crater. The smugglers were laying down a heavy, sustained suppressing fire, completely unbothered by the giant biomechanical alien projection pacing back and forth above them. Arthur quickly assessed the tactical disadvantage of their situation. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a standard-issue Federation concussion grenade. But instead of throwing it at the barricaded smugglers, he hurled it directly into the center of the massive holographic projector array, humming in the middle of the room. The resulting detonation did not just shatter the delicate optical equipment. It sent a cascading, catastrophic power surge through the warehouse's localized grid. The towering monster vanished instantly, replaced by a shower of blinding electrical sparks that momentarily blinded the smuggler syndicate. Xylar did not waste the brief tactical advantage. She stepped out from cover, her movements a blur of hyper-logical geometry, and fired 4 precise, mathematically perfect stun rounds. The avian captain and his 3 heavily armed lieutenants crumpled to the floor, instantly incapacitated before they could clear their vision. Arthur kicked a fallen plasma rifle away from the captain's twitching hand and cautiously approached the massive central terminal. The screen was scrolling with a dizzying amount of encrypted data, flashing that deep, urgent crimson Xylar had noticed earlier. She holstered her weapon and joined him, her pale fingers flying across the alien keyboard with inhuman rhythmic speed. She effortlessly bypassed the first layer of security, her dark eyes reflecting the chaotic stream of code. She stated with absolute certainty that this was not a simple bootleg operation designed for localized black market profit. The data architecture was entirely wrong for standard peer-to-peer distribution. She brought up a secondary schematic on the primary terminal. Arthur leaned in, immediately recognizing the complex, jagged blueprints. They were schematics for illegal psychic amplifiers. These devices had been outlawed centuries ago. Designed originally during the early days of the Federation to help non-telepathic species communicate complex emotional concepts to the Zenthari. However, they were incredibly dangerous because they could easily be inverted to broadcast overwhelming emotional states across vast distances, forcing the receiver to biologically experience the transmitted feeling. The smugglers were not just copying movies. They were splicing these military-grade amplifiers directly into the highest tension scenes of Earth's most terrifying cinematic creations. Arthur pulled up one of the active video files currently being processed through the amplifier array to see exactly what they were working with. On the screen, a group of human teenagers was exploring an abandoned, visibly dilapidated cabin in the woods. The audio track featured a heavy, ominous thumping coming from beneath the floorboards. Xylar observed the scene with intense analytical focus. She pointed to the screen and noted that the structural integrity of the dwelling was severely compromised, and the acoustic signature clearly indicated a large, potentially hostile mass located in the subterranean level. She logically concluded that the optimal survival strategy for the humans was immediate evacuation, followed by the requisition of heavy atmospheric bombardment to neutralize the unknown threat. Instead, on the screen, a solitary teenager wearing completely inadequate clothing grabbed a dim, flickering flashlight and slowly opened the basement door, calling out into the pitch-black void to see if anyone was hiding down there. Xylar froze, her perfectly structured Kalen logic centers visibly stalling out. She turned to Arthur, her expression a mask of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. She demanded to know why the biological unit was willingly descending into a tactically disadvantageous, unlit, subterranean enclosure when the presence of a lethal threat was so heavily telegraphed. Arthur could not help but laugh, the warm sound echoing strangely in the cavernous, sparking warehouse. He leaned against the console, crossing his arms, and found himself suddenly acting as a professor of ridiculous human behavior. He explained that it was a foundational rule of the horror genre, a narrative device specifically designed to maximize audience anxiety. He told her that if people in horror movies made smart, logical, Kalen-approved decisions, the story would be over in 5 minutes and nobody would ever buy a ticket. He had to gently break it to her that humanity actually found the terrible decision-making somewhat comedic in hindsight, functioning as a shared cultural acknowledgement of what absolutely not to do when the power goes out. Zylar shook her head slowly, murmuring under her breath that human entertainment was a monument to irrationality. But the brief moment of levity evaporated entirely as Zylar finally cracked the core encryption of the smuggling ring's master directory. The files were not labeled with movie titles or genre classifications. They were labeled with the names of prominent, heavily populated Federation colony worlds. She opened a series of hidden text documents buried deep beneath the video files. It was a sprawling, aggressively worded manifesto, authored by a radical political faction calling themselves the Eclipse Vanguard. Arthur read the glowing text over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. The Eclipse Vanguard believed that the Federation's enforced millennia of utter peace had not enlightened the galaxy at all. It had merely domesticated it. They viewed the High Council as weak, stagnant tyrants who had robbed sentient life of its evolutionary edge by systematically eliminating all struggle and hardship. To these extremists, humanity's violent, chaotic history, and the terrifying media it produced to cope with that history, was undeniable proof that the universe was inherently a place of predation and survival, not harmonious singing crystals and endless diplomacy. The faction was funding the black market not for credits, but to distribute the fear media as a softening tactic. Their true endgame was far more devastating. They were using the psychic amplifiers to create targeted, localized mass hysteria events on a planetary scale. By bombarding a peaceful, biologically unshielded colony world with an amplified, inescapable broadcast of primal human terror, they intended to completely break the population's collective psyche. The resulting chaos, riots, and inevitable societal collapse would serve as their ultimate proof to the galaxy that the Federation's utopian ideals were fragile illusions, easily shattered by a single, carefully crafted nightmare. They wanted to tear down the government and return the entire galaxy to a state of natural, brutal selection. Zylar extracted a heavily encrypted set of spatial coordinates from the terminal's routing history. The data stream was actively bouncing off several automated relay satellites, a sophisticated technique designed to obscure the true origin of the master broadcast signal. However, her Kalen intellect allowed her to isolate the final destination of the massive data upload. The coordinates pointed to an uncharted sector of space, far outside standard security directorate patrol routes, a dead zone where Federation sensors rarely swept due to intense ambient radiation. The screen suddenly flashed with a new, rapidly declining numerical sequence. The terminal indicated a countdown sequence had just been initiated for a test broadcast, and the target was a highly populated agricultural world inhabited entirely by the extremely sensitive Zenthari diaspora. Arthur and Zylar shared a look of grim realization, knowing that whoever was waiting for them at the end of those coordinates was holding a loaded gun to the head of 1 billion innocent minds. The dead zone of Sector 81 was a cosmic graveyard, choked with the jagged bones of shattered asteroids and bathed in the toxic glow of a dying red dwarf. Deep within this celestial wreckage, a ghost ship was preparing to broadcast a scream that would shatter the galaxy. Zylar piloted her stealth interceptor through the churning debris field, her pale hands moving across the flight yoke with mathematical precision. The encrypted coordinates had led them directly to a decommissioned plasma mining rig, a sprawling, rusted monstrosity clinging like a metallic parasite to the side of a massive, hollowed-out asteroid. It was completely dark on standard Federation sensors, masked heavily by the ambient radiation of the dying star. It was the perfect staging ground for intergalactic terrorism. Isolated from any immediate security patrols or planetary defense grids, they breached an auxiliary airlock, the heavy blast doors hissing open to reveal a dimly lit, cavernous interior. The air was stale, carrying the sharp metallic tang of ozone and old machine oil. As they navigated the winding, shadowy corridors toward the central broadcast array, Arthur quickly realized the Eclipse Vanguard had been busy redecorating. The extremists had become dangerously obsessed with the very human media they were weaponizing, but their alien understanding of the tropes was disastrously literal. Arthur threw his arm out, stopping Xylar just as her combat boot hovered over a raised metal grate. He pointed to a series of heavy, industrial mining lasers rigged to the ceiling, all aimed directly at the floor in a staggered pattern. It was a crude, highly lethal recreation of a classic cinematic trap room. He explained in a hushed whisper that the villains in these scenarios always left a convoluted, perfectly timed gap in the firing sequence. A dramatic flair meant to give the protagonist a false sense of hope before the final act. Xylar analyzed the firing pattern, her eyes darting across the laser emitters. She confirmed his absurd theory in seconds, mapping the precise geometric window. Together, they executed a perfectly timed sprint through the lethal corridor, dodging the searing beams of concentrated heat by mere millimeters. In the next sector, they triggered a pressure plate, causing heavy blast doors to slam shut on both ends of the room. The reinforced walls immediately began inching inward, accompanied by a completely unnecessary, ominous ticking countdown projected on a massive wall monitor. Arthur did not panic. He simply drew Xylar's secondary sidearm, aimed at an exposed hydraulic control panel conveniently glowing with a red light, and fired. The walls ground to a screeching halt. He handed the weapon back, laughing softly, noting that the bad guys always put the off switch inside the trap to ensure the audience got a good look at the hero's resourcefulness. But the twisted homage to human cinema turned deadly as they entered the primary processing sector. A heavy security drone dropped silently from the ceiling rafters. It was a terrifying piece of machinery, modified with jagged welding torches and covered in dark, synthetic fluids to mimic a butcher's apron. It was a clear, horrifying nod to Earth's invincible slasher villains. The machine locked its optical sensors onto Xylar, its internal engine roaring to life as it charged forward, raising a spinning thermal saw meant for cutting through solid bedrock. There was absolutely no time for Kalan geometry or logical evasive maneuvers. Arthur lunged, slamming his entire body weight into Xylar. They crashed hard onto the grated steel floor, sliding violently behind a heavy structural pillar just as the drone's saw cleaved through the space where Xylar's head had been a fraction of a second prior. Sparks showered over them like brutal rain as the saw bit deeply into the metal pillar. Arthur lay firmly on top of her, shielding her with his body. His chest heaved, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. Xylar looked up at him, her obsidian eyes wide, processing the raw data of his physiological state. She stated with absolute clinical precision that his biological fear response was peaking at dangerous levels. Yet he had deliberately overridden his primary survival instinct to shield her from terminal damage. She demanded to know why he would willingly embrace a tactically inferior position that guaranteed his own destruction. Arthur looked down into her pale face, his own expression softening despite the deafening noise of the drone trying to cut through their cover. He told her that fear was not just a panic button designed to make you run away. It was a spotlight. It showed you exactly what you were entirely terrified of losing. He explained that true courage was never the absence of fear, but rather the profound decision that something else in the universe was simply more important. A profound shift occurred within Xylar's hyper-logical mind. She reached up, her cool fingers gently tracing the rough line of his jaw. The biological paradox of humanity finally clicked into place for her. Their fragile, terrified nature was the exact engine of their fierce, unyielding devotion. She felt a surge of something warm and entirely illogical bloom in her chest. A sudden, fierce desire to protect this chaotic human at all costs. The quiet, charged, romantic revelation was violently interrupted by the blinding flash of a wide-beam stun field. Arthur and Xylar convulsed as the neuroparalytic energy washed over them, their muscles locking up instantly into rigid, painful statues. They collapsed onto the deck plates side by side, completely immobilized but entirely conscious. Heavy, armored footsteps echoed through the processing chamber. The leader of the Eclipse Vanguard emerged from the shadows, stepping over the deactivated security drone. He was a rogue Thracian, his massive four-armed frame covered in jagged, self-inflicted ritualistic scars. He sneered at the paralyzed duo, flanked by heavily armed mercenaries wearing tactical gear painted with macabre, grinning skulls. The mercenaries dragged Arthur and Xylar by their collars, pulling them into the central control room. It was a massive circular chamber dominated by a towering, pulsating psychic amplifier array that hummed with a sickening deep bass vibration. The Thracian leader laughed, a harsh, grinding sound that grated against the ears, and approached the primary terminal. He looked down at Arthur, mocking the fragility of the human form, and proudly revealed the true, devastating scope of his masterpiece. The countdown targeting the distant agricultural world had been nothing but a phantom signal, a simple decoy meant to draw the bulk of the security directorate's fleet into the outer rim. He gestured toward a massive holographic projection of the Milky Way galaxy glowing above the main console. A thick, red transmission line was locked directly onto Oakhaven, the glittering jewel of the Federation. The extremist leader explained that his technicians had spent months splicing together a bespoke mega-horror montage. It was a concentrated, agonizing blend of humanity's most primal cinematic nightmares. Stripped of all narrative context and distilled down to pure, unfiltered psychological terror. Driven through the illegal military-grade amplifiers, the broadcast would carry enough psychic weight to physically damage a conscious mind. Worse yet, he had timed the transmission perfectly. In exactly 10 minutes, the entire Federation High Council, along with billions of citizens on the capital world, would link their minds to the planetary neural net for the annual Solstice Harmony ceremony. They would be completely open, biologically receptive, and entirely defenseless. The broadcast would hit the neural net like a psychic superweapon, instantly shattering the minds of the galaxy's leadership and plunging the Federation into immediate, irreversible madness. The Thracian leader slammed his heavy hand onto the terminal, locking the firing sequence. The massive amplifier array began to spin, glowing with a nauseating, sickly violet light as it drew power directly from the station's main reactor. The final countdown initiated on the primary screen, large crimson numbers ticking down the final minutes of galactic sanity. Arthur strained against his paralyzed muscles, his eyes locked on the console, desperately trying to force his body to move as the hum of the machine grew into a deafening roar. The countdown clock did not just mark the passage of time. It pulsed with the rhythm of a galaxy about to lose its mind. 10 minutes was all that stood between the peaceful Federation and an eternity of screaming. The sickly violet light of the psychic amplifier bathed the central control room in the hues of a bruised sky. The machine roared, a deep vibration that rattled the teeth in Arthur's skull. The Thracian leader turned his back on his paralyzed captives, mesmerized by the glowing holographic map of the capital world. Oakhaven. He was busy savoring his victory, entirely unaware of a fundamental flaw in his own weaponized technology. The stun field holding Arthur and Xylar captive relied on a stable, predictable neural baseline to maintain its paralytic grip. But the massive amplifier array was not just preparing to broadcast to the capital. It was already leaking raw, uncompressed terror into the station's local environment. The ambient psychic pressure in the room spiked instantly. For a Federation species, this was paralyzing. For a human, this was simply an uncomfortable level of anxiety. Arthur felt the rigid lock on his muscles begin to stutter as the localized fear disrupted the stun field's frequency. Humanity had evolved to fight or run when terrified, not freeze indefinitely. He channeled the rising tide of artificial dread flooding the room directly into a surge of adrenaline. His fingers twitched, then his jaw unlocked. With a massive, agonizing effort, he forced his arm to move, breaking the energy tether binding him to the deck plates. He rolled toward Xylar, his hands quickly finding the mechanical release valve on her restraints. She gasped as the paralysis faded, her obsidian eyes wide with a terrifying new sensation. The ambient dread leaking from the machine was bypassing her Kalen logic centers, flooding her highly structured mind with chaotic, irrational data. She was experiencing the ghosts of 1,000 human horror movies all at once, and her brain had no filing system for monsters hiding in the dark. Arthur hauled her to her feet, his grip on her hand tight and anchoring. He told her to focus entirely on his voice and ignore the shadows. They bolted from the control room just as the Thracian leader realized they were gone, his furious roar lost in the rising hum of the amplifier. The situation in the corridors outside had rapidly devolved into pure, unadulterated madness. The first waves of the broadcast were hitting the station's internal network, and the heavily armed Eclipse Vanguard mercenaries were discovering the true cost of their own weapon. Because alien species lacked the mental calluses to process fear. The massive dose of amplified dread caused their suppressed anxieties to violently project outward. The illegal psychic amplifiers were turning the mercenaries' subconscious terrors into shimmering, highly destructive physical energy fields. A Thracian guard stumbled past them, clawing at his own throat as a swirling vortex of localized vacuum, his deepest biological fear of suffocation, manifested around his head, ripping the heavy metal paneling straight off the walls. Further down the hall, a Maruvian enforcer shrieked as a wave of crackling. Superheated thermal energy materialized from thin air, a physical projection of its primal terror of dehydration. The station was literally tearing itself apart, crushed by the weight of weaponized nightmares. Xylar stumbled, her pale hands clutching her temples. Her impeccable posture faltered as the psychic storm ravaged her senses. She stated, her voice straining, that the environmental physics were completely collapsing and the math of the corridor was no longer functionally sound. The sheer irrationality of the physical manifestations was threatening to short-circuit her intellect. Arthur pulled her close, throwing his arm around her waist to keep her moving. He explained that logic was useless in a haunted house. He told her she had to stop trying to calculate the trajectory of the ghosts and just keep running toward the exit. He drew heavily on his human resilience, his innate ability to compartmentalize absolute terror. He looked at the twisting, shifting architecture of the failing station and treated it like a poorly designed carnival attraction. A massive, shifting energy field resembling a cluster of jagged, predatory teeth blocked their path. Arthur did not slow down. He fired Xylar's sidearm directly into an overhead coolant pipe. A thick, freezing fog of liquid nitrogen erupted into the corridor, momentarily disrupting the thermal signature of the psychic manifestation. He dragged Xylar through the freezing mist, his shoulder slamming into the heavy metal door of the primary transmission core. They spilled into the heart of the station. This was the belly of the beast, a towering cylindrical chamber housing the main feed line that connected the amplifier to the Galactic relay network. The countdown clock above the core read exactly 4 minutes. The room was guarded by the Thracian leader's elite vanguard, 4 towering bruisers clad in heavy combat armor. But the psychic bleed was affecting them too. They were firing wildly at empty corners, their weapons discharging blasts of plasma into the ceiling as they fought invisible demons. Arthur assessed the room in a fraction of a second. He told Xylar to get to the main terminal and sever the routing protocols, promising her he would handle the distraction. Before she could protest the tactical absurdity of a single human fighting 4 armored giants, Arthur launched himself into the fray. He used the mercenaries' own hallucinations against them. He picked up a discarded metal pipe and struck the floor rhythmically, mimicking the heavy, ominous footsteps of the cinematic monster currently projected into the room's psychic ether. The closest Thracian spun around, his 4 eyes wide with manufactured terror, and fired a devastating plasma volley directly into the path of his own squadmate, while Arthur danced through the chaotic crossfire, relying entirely on human agility and the sheer unpredictability of his movements. Xylar reached the core terminal. She forced her trembling hands onto the alien keyboard. Her mind was a battleground, caught between the immaculate equations of her Kalan heritage and the screaming primal dread broadcasting from the machine behind her. She fought to isolate the routing subroutines, her fingers flying across the glowing interface. Arthur ducked under a wildly swinging armored fist, sweeping the legs of a panicked mercenary and sending him crashing into a server rack. He glanced at the clock. 2 minutes. The Thracian leader suddenly burst through the main doors, his massive frame radiating pure fury. He had bypassed the psychic storms by injecting himself with a heavy dose of synthetic combat stimulants, making his mind too fast to process the fear. He locked his sights on Xylar at the terminal and charged, drawing a massive, vibrating kinetic blade. Arthur threw himself across the room, tackling the behemoth just as the blade swung downward. They crashed onto the grated floor, a tangle of limbs and desperate violence. Arthur was severely outmatched in strength, but he fought with the frantic, clawing desperation of a species born on a death world. He held the Thracian's weapon arm back, his muscles burning as the blade inched closer to his chest. He yelled for Xylar to finish the hack. Xylar's eyes locked onto the screen. The routing protocols were heavily encrypted with a biometric failsafe. She could not simply delete the broadcast. She had to physically redirect the massive flow of data into a dead end. The terminal demanded a manual override directly from the amplifier's central housing, an action that required stepping into the absolute epicenter of the psychic storm. She looked at Arthur, struggling against the towering extremist, his face strained but his eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding resolve. She realized the math of survival required a variable she had never used before. 1 minute remained on the clock. The machine screamed louder, the violet light intensifying to a blinding pitch. The fate of billions rested on a choice between perfect logic and utter, terrifying chaos. There is a limit to how much terror a biological mind can process before it simply shuts off forever. Humanity was about to test if that limit actually existed. The central control room was tearing itself apart, the walls groaning under the immense pressure of the localized psychic storm. Arthur was losing his grappling match with the heavily stimulated Thracian extremist leader. The massive alien had leverage, weight, and the chemical advantage of synthetic combat narcotics flooding his system. The vibrating kinetic blade was inches from Arthur's chest, the heat radiating off the hyper-sharpened edge. Xylar stood at the terminal, her hands hovering over the encrypted routing controls. She saw the prompt demanding a manual override at the core. She looked at the towering amplifier array, radiating a concentrated, sickening violet light that promised absolute mental destruction. To step into that epicenter meant exposing her highly ordered, pristine Kylan mind to the raw, unfiltered essence of irrational panic. It was a mathematical certainty that her consciousness would shatter into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. She drew her sidearm, perfectly calculating the trajectory to avoid hitting Arthur, and fired a high-yield plasma bolt directly into the Thracian leader's heavily armored knee joint. The behemoth roared, his leg buckling instantly. The kinetic blade sparked against the deck plates as his weight shifted. Arthur did not hesitate. He twisted his body, using his legs to hurl the massive alien off him and into a bank of sparking auxiliary servers. Arthur scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving. He looked at the countdown clock. 45 seconds. He looked at Xylar, then at the pulsing violet heart of the amplifier array. He knew instantly what the terminal had demanded of her, and he knew she could not survive it. A mind built entirely on logic cannot process a nightmare. It simply breaks trying to solve it. But a human mind was a different engine entirely. A human mind was forged in the dark. Arthur sprinted past the terminal, leaving Xylar behind. He threw himself into the center of the amplifier ring. The physical heat of the machine was intense, but the psychic pressure was a crushing weight. He grabbed the twin crystalline control rods that served as the manual override interfaces. The moment his bare hands touched the crystals, the physical world simply ceased to exist. Arthur was instantly pulled into a terrifying, sprawling mindscape. It was the mega horror montage, a bespoke weapon compiled from the darkest, most visceral fears ever recorded in human cinema, amplified by a factor of 1,000,000. He was no longer on a decaying orbital station. He was completely alone in an endless, suffocating forest where the trees breathed and the shadows possessed physical weight. The psychic assault was absolute. It hit him with the primal dread of being hunted by an unseen apex predator. It flooded his veins with the claustrophobic terror of being buried alive in a shrinking box. It bombarded his retinas with distorted, impossible geometries and figures residing deep within the uncanny valley. Things that looked almost human but moved with jerky, arachnid wrongness. He fell to his knees in the mental projection, screaming as the collective anxieties of humanity threatened to drown him. He felt the cold, crushing depths of the midnight ocean. He felt the vast, uncaring void of deep space. He felt his own deepest, most guarded insecurities violently ripped to the surface. The machine was feeding him the paralyzing fear that he was entirely inadequate, that his diplomatic mission was a failure, that he was the reason his species was going to be exiled or destroyed. The psychic pain was agonizing. The broadcast was designed to shatter a mature, peaceful alien mind in a fraction of a second. Arthur was holding out through sheer, stubborn human resilience. But the sheer volume of the data was corroding his sanity. He could feel his identity fraying at the edges, dissolving into a puddle of pure, unadulterated panic. Back in the physical room, Xylar watched Arthur's body seize violently. He was locked onto the control rods, his muscles strained to the breaking point, his eyes rolled back in his head. The countdown clock read 20 seconds. The violet light was strobing frantically, ready to dump this nightmare directly into the minds of the Federation High Council. Xylar calculated the odds of his survival. They were functionally zero. Her logic centers demanded she evacuate the area, preserve her own life, and prepare a planetary quarantine for Oakhaven. But the warmth in her chest, the highly illogical biological paradox she had discovered earlier, overrode her programming. She refused to accept a universe where Arthur Vance died terrified and alone. She abandoned the safety of the terminal. She marched directly into the violet light, fighting through the physical resistance of the psychic storm, and threw her arms around Arthur's rigid body. She pressed her forehead directly against the base of his neck, utilizing the intense ambient energy field of the amplifier to force a rudimentary telepathic bridge between them. Inside the nightmare, the endless forest was closing in on Arthur. The shadows were growing teeth. He was curling into a ball, ready to surrender to the dark. Suddenly, the chaotic, swirling sky of the mindscape fractured. A massive, glowing geometric grid slammed down over the twisted landscape. The suffocating fog was instantly compartmentalized by lines of blinding blue light. Arthur gasped, his mind suddenly flooded with a cool, pristine clarity. It was Xylar. She had breached his mind, lending him the sheer, unyielding power of her Kalan intellect. She could not fight the monsters, but she could categorize them. Her voice echoed in his consciousness, steady, melodic, and completely devoid of fear. She informed him that the biological threats present in this simulation were statistically impossible. She pointed out the structural flaws in the shifting architecture of his nightmare. She anchored him, providing a solid foundation of pure reason in the middle of an emotional hurricane. With her logic bracing his mind, the paralyzing grip of the terror broke. Arthur stopped running. He stood up in the mental landscape, the geometric grid pulsing around him. He looked at the creeping, faceless horrors closing in on him. He finally understood the ultimate lesson of his own culture. Fear was never meant to be a master. It was never an enemy to be avoided or a disease to be cured. It was a teacher. It was the biological alarm bell that told a species they were alive, that they had something worth fighting for, and that it was time to wake up and get to work. Arthur did not try to suppress the fear. He grabbed it. He took the concentrated, weaponized terror pouring into him from the amplifier and weaponized it right back. He embraced the adrenaline, the anger, the fierce, unyielding human instinct to survive the dark. He funneled that massive surge of defiant energy directly back through the psychic bridge and down his arms into the crystalline control rods. In the physical control room, the psychic feedback loop reversed direction. The illegal amplifier was designed to broadcast fear, not to receive the sheer, overwhelming defiance of a species that ate nightmares for breakfast. The machine could not process the paradox of a terrified mind fighting back. The sickly violet light flared into a blinding, agonizing white. The deep bass hum of the generator spiked into a high-pitched structural squeal. The countdown clock hit 3 seconds. The twin crystalline control rods shattered in Arthur's hands, exploding into a cloud of harmless, glittering dust. The massive amplifier array above them overloaded, the internal conduits blowing out in a cascading series of spectacular, fiery detonations. The energy field collapsed instantly, plunging the room into the harsh, flickering glow of emergency backup lighting. The broadcast was dead. The signal to Oakhaven was severed. Arthur collapsed backward, his body entirely spent, gasping for the stale, metallic air of the station. Xylar went down with him, her arms still wrapped tightly around his shoulders. They lay tangled together on the grated floor, the burning wreckage of the extremist superweapon raining down around them. The silence that followed the destruction of the machine was the loudest thing Arthur had ever heard. He turned his head to look at Xylar. Her flawless, pale skin was covered in soot, and her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess. She looked completely out of her element, exhausted and entirely beautiful. She looked back at him, her obsidian eyes scanning his face, verifying his vital signs without the aid of a data slate. The crisis had been averted, but the heavy blast doors to the core room were dented and groaning under the continued assault of the surviving Vanguard mercenaries outside. The station was still falling apart, its structural integrity critically compromised by the psychic anomalies. Getting out alive was going to require navigating a decaying labyrinth filled with angry, heavily armed extremists who no longer had a galaxy to conquer. And beyond that, the High Council would still demand a reckoning for the events that had transpired in the shadows. But as Arthur looked at the Kalan investigator who had just risked her sanity to save his life, he smiled. He knew they could handle whatever came next. The smoking ruin of a weaponized nightmare is a strangely peaceful place to realize you have just saved 1 trillion minds. But Arthur Vance barely had time to process the victory before the heavy blast doors of the transmission core finally gave way entirely. The surviving Eclipse Vanguard mercenaries poured into the room, their weapons raised and their eyes wild with the lingering effects of the localized psychic storm. They were desperate, furious, and ready to execute the humans who had ruined their grand revolution. However, they were abruptly interrupted by the deafening roar of a Federation-breaching torpedo tearing through the station's thick outer hull. The cavalry had not been entirely fooled by the decoy signal after all. During the chaotic sprint through the failing station, Xylar had managed to slip a heavily encrypted micro-burst distress beacon into the station's ambient data stream just before the main system overloaded. Heavily armored Kalan shock troops flooded the central chamber from multiple breach points, moving with terrifying mathematical precision to disarm and detain the bewildered extremists. Laser sights painted the mercenaries, forcing them to drop their weapons to the grated deck. For the first time since he had arrived in space as a disgraced diplomat, Arthur was not the one being thrown to the floor in restraints. Instead, a Kalan medic gently wrapped a thermal shock blanket around his shoulders, treating him with a newfound, profound respect. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in the grand pavilion of Oakhaven was entirely different. The shattered singing crystals from the disastrous movie screening had been swept away, replaced by stark, functional seating arrangements. The High Council was convened once again, not to judge humanity, but to listen. The towering holograms of the alien delegates flickered with an unfamiliar humility. They had seen the unredacted after-action reports from Sector 81. They knew exactly how close the Galactic Federation had come to complete irreversible psychic collapse. Arthur stood at the central podium, wearing a crisp diplomatic suit, though he still carried a slight limp from his brutal physical encounter with the Thracian behemoth. He did not apologize for human culture. He leaned into the microphone and delivered a profound, unvarnished truth to the assembled rulers of the galaxy. He told them that a society entirely shielded from hardship is a society made of glass. He explained that by systematically eradicating all predatory threats and outlawing the mere concept of fear, the Federation had not achieved pure enlightenment. They had simply engineered their own ultimate fragility. When the Eclipse Vanguard weaponized the dark, the galaxy had absolutely no immune system to fight it off. Human horror movies, he stated firmly, were not biological weapons designed to inflict pain. They were a controlled inoculation. He explained that humanity learned to tell terrifying stories around the campfire because the fire was the only thing keeping the predatory wildlife at bay. They simulated the worst-case scenarios in art so that when the real monsters broke through the tree line, they would not freeze in panic. They would fight back. Fear taught a species how to compartmentalize dread, how to find courage when logic completely failed, and most importantly, how to protect the person standing next to you when the universe turned hostile. The High Consul, the majestic avian being who had previously demanded Earth's immediate exile, lowered his feathered head in slow, reluctant agreement. The evidence presented by the ruined orbital station was undeniable. A single human and a Kalan investigator operating completely outside her logical parameters had saved the capital precisely because they knew how to navigate terror. The Council officially repealed the absolute ban on human media. In its place, they established a rigorous, highly regulated quarantine and classification system. Human cinematic and literary archives would be reopened, but strictly monitored. Mature species would be allowed to study the media safely in controlled environments, accompanied by human guides who could provide vital emotional anchoring and cultural context. The Thracian military immediately requested access to psychological thrillers to begin building mental calluses for their elite guard. Humanity was no longer the pariah of the Federation. They were now its official psychological defense instructors, tasked with teaching a gentle galaxy how to survive the shadows. Yet, intelligence reports from the Outer Rim suggested the Eclipse Vanguard still had sleeper cells hiding in the dead zones, waiting to test this newly hardened federation in the near future. That evening, Arthur stood on a sweeping pearl wood balcony overlooking the glittering bioluminescent sprawl of the capital city. The pearlescent spires glowed softly against the breathtaking backdrop of a vibrant, unfamiliar nebula. Xylar stepped out to join him, having traded her rigid, angular tactical uniform for a sleek, dark civilian tunic. She stood close to him, their shoulders brushing in the cool night air. She looked out at the alien stars and quietly admitted that she was currently experiencing a massive influx of entirely irrational dopamine, and her logic centers were completely failing to regulate her elevated heart rate whenever she was in his direct proximity. Arthur smiled, wrapping his arm securely around her waist and pulling her closer. He told her that falling in love was the oldest, most terrifying human trope in the cinematic playbook, and the only logical response was to simply let the narrative play out. Xylar leaned her head against his shoulder, asking if this meant they were now the designated protagonists who had to investigate strange noises in the dark. Arthur laughed, a warm sound that carried over the balcony. He assured her that they were the couple that called for an orbital strike and went out for a nice dinner instead. They looked out over the city together, acknowledging that the universe was vast, chaotic, and inherently scary. But they had definitively proven that it was much better faced side by side. It left Arthur quietly wondering just how the deeply empathic Xanthari would react to their first officially sanctioned screening of an earth-shattering romantic comedy. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the galactic consequences of human fear and resilience, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. Leave the word resilience in the comments below so I know you made it to the very end of the journey. And do not forget to hit that hype button to help push this narrative out to more viewers who need a genuinely good story today.